Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Season Finals Upper Bracket Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this. It's the final tournament, the final games of the LEC season domestically. By the end of this tournament, we're going to know every single team qualifying to Worlds from the LEC, what seed they will be, and what team seasons will be ending that are, of course, in this tournament. There is a lot to determine even just today. In fact, you could argue that these are some of the most important series of the entire tournament, the top 4 seeds going head-to-head. Of course, our Summer Split champions, G2, they don't have a ton to play for. It's really just bragging rights for them as they have already qualified for Worlds by winning the Summer Split, but theoretically, we could know another team that qualifies alongside them by the end of this video, depending on the results of it. Obviously, we will cover that when we get to it, but if you want to know my thoughts on how we got here and what I expect of this tournament, please check out the video up in the iCard. That is a preview for this entire bracket where I give my predictions for every single series, where I talk about every single team in depth and what you can expect of them, and I give all of my award picks for the entire year. MVP, Rookie of the Year, all of the All-Pro teams, all of that stuff is in that video. There are some spicy takes that people did not like very much, and so if you want to know what all the fuss is about, check that video out and leave a comment on there. I'm always interested to hear how egregiously my opinions are different from LEC fans, which they typically are, but today's video is mostly just going to be covering round number 1. We will be previewing the upcoming series at the end of the video, but most of today will be covering the 2 series we got this past weekend. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and then at the end of the video, like I said, we will be previewing the upcoming series that we are going to get next week, talking about where I think the LEC could be moving in the future. We will hopefully know some teams that are getting closer to qualification for Worlds at the end of this video, but you never really know. It all really depends on how the games end up going, and there's really no other way to start than kicking us off with our first series of the season finals, a rematch of the semifinals in the Summer Split this past month or so. It is going to be a matchup between the number 2 seeded Fnatic and the number 3 seeded Team BDS. This is a matchup we've gotten quite a bit over the course of this year. 2 of the more consistent teams across the LEC. It's not really surprising at all to see them in the upper echelon here. Of course, seeding was done based on championship points, and so for Fnatic and BDS, who have basically been contenders every single split, this makes sense. Fnatic obviously kind of has the edge, and they're definitely going to be the favorites coming in here, but how do they match up against each other, at least on paper? How have they matched up against each other across this year so far? Fnatic has just been a lot more clinical in terms of their execution. I think the problem for BDS is they just don't really have an answer to the kind of middle-of-the-map dominance that Fnatic can offer. Razork and Humanoid are both very, very strong players, obviously, and Razork in particular has been in incredible form. Humanoid often steps up when games matter more, and so when you reach these important best-of-5s when you're playing against Fnatic, if you don't really have a great answer in the middle of the map, oftentimes that can lead to a team just not really being able to be competitive with Fnatic, and unfortunately, that's kind of been the case for BDS. I like Nuke. I think he's been awesome over the course of this year, but big games aren't exactly his specialty. At least they haven't been in the LEC so far. And Sheo is somebody that I think is just kind of a weaker version of Razork, right? I think Sheo is an interesting player, but Razork is certainly more consistent. He's been the best jungler in the LEC over the course of this year. That's not to say that BDS doesn't have their own advantages. I think their bot lane is just better. Ice and Labrov should be more consistent. The problem is they're very late game focused. They're not really all that dominant in the 2v2, which can lead to scenarios in which BDS gets behind early, and Ice and Labrov really aren't there to save the game, but both of them are arguably the best team fighters in the entire region, and so if you can get Ice into a position where he can 1v5 towards the back half of the game, then he will absolutely capitalize on that. And then you've got Adam, who's just a complete wild card on the top of the map. When he is good, he is the best top laner in the LEC, and it's not even particularly close. It's not even just on the champions he's good at either. He is very versatile, a lot more than people give him credit for, and he can really pull out a lot of different things. However, when he's bad, he's awful, and honestly, he's not exactly been in the best form coming off of this Summer Split, which really hasn't been his best in a while. I think 2024 was worse for him than 2023 was, even if he still was good, and the consistency definitely is a bit neutered, I would say, going into this section. Not that Oscar Rinnan is some sort of superstar talent in the top lane, but he's more than good enough to be able to take advantage of a player who is struggling at the current moment, and so I think a lot of this series is going to be up to which, major lane for these two teams is going to be able to get a bigger lead. Is it going to be Razork and Humanoid in the middle of the map, or is it going to be Ice and Labrov in the bottom side of the map? And I think that's why I'm just favoring Fnatic in this one. I think they are more consistent. I think Noah and Jun should be fine in a series like this. Oscar might even be able to take advantage of Adam and his inconsistencies. We've seen Fnatic beat BDS quite a bit. They're definitely the favorites going into this series, but anything can happen in the season finals. It's one best of 5 if you're able to play well on the day. Moving on to winners finals is ginormous in a tournament like this. This is a massive series for both teams, but only one team is going to be able to take it, and we get to find out by going game by game, and that means starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Fnatic. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0 and really establish themselves at the start of this series. This was a pretty dominant game. Goes about 40 minutes. It takes 3 Barons, but Fnatic was rarely ever in a position where it felt like they could have even been aggressed on, let alone lose control of the game. This was one of those games where I think Fnatic's kind of finished to the summer split playoffs actually probably played a bit of a part into their mental going into this, because genuinely they really struggled to close out games in the playoffs. It's not a secret. It's not something that we're shying away from. They played against G2 in the finals, were up in the beginning of every single one of those games and ended up throwing all of them. There's definitely some sort of decision paralysis, I would say, on Fnatic right now in terms of their mental, and you could see it in this game. They were coming into this, they were generating a gigantic early lead. They were so strong in the early, late game, the late mid game, if you will, right around that 20-minute mark, and they just couldn't quite break through a lot of things because they were scared to go for a full-on engage. They ended up just playing for small advantage after small advantage after small advantage, and eventually those stacked up enough where BDS made a gigantic mistake and the game was over. But I still want to see more decisiveness come out of Fnatic. This isn't exactly the most encouraging game in the entire world. I am going to congratulate the players individually because I think the mechanics were there. They were able to generate the lead pretty consistently, and they never really felt like they were worse in any particular role, but I just want to see them as a team make decisions that are a little bit more concrete instead of just dancing around the topic of trying to win the game and extrapolate your lead into bigger advantages. Player of the game for me is going to go to Noah in the bot lane. Felt like he was the most consistent at the very least. His early game could have definitely been a bit better. I think Ice was definitely the strength of BDS, as has kind of been the case over the course of the last year or so. Ice and Labrov have definitely been the strength of BDS. The 2v2 was once again pretty good from the Misfortune and the Alistair, but Noah did a very good job in these team fights of keeping things relevant, specifically on that not soul fight towards the back half of the game where he was I think he ended up picking up a triple or a quadra or something like that, and that really is what separated that gold lead. It allowed Fnatic to get their second Baron, and from that point onwards, the game was just over. Really nothing you can do at that point. Jun obviously helped quite a bit on the Braum, but it wasn't one of those takeover Mickey X style Braum performances where he plays super aggro and is, playing battle Braum, if you will. This is much more protector Braum, and he did his job. He tanked a bunch of damage for Oscar and Razork and Noah and even Huma at times, and, he did his thing. It wasn't exactly the flashiest game in the world, though, which is why he's not getting player of the game for me. That is going to Noah. Humanoid had a couple of really flashy plays on the Yone, but I think the consistency could have been a bit better. A couple of bad decisions that did not end up getting punished because he is just better than the players that he's playing against. Razork was pretty solid, but most of his impact was in the early game. The Vi really didn't scale particularly well in terms of creating impact plays towards the back half, and Oscar was good for ultimates. He definitely comboed off the rest of the team well, but didn't really make a ton of plays on his own. Overall, Fnatic was good, but I want to see them be great. We're waiting for this team to really be decisive and really show that, this is one of the more talented teams going to Worlds. They could compete to get out of the, Swiss stage and get into the top 8. I just don't know if I feel that coming off of game number 1. Hopefully that can change going into the rest of this series, but for BDS, just not a great look. I mean, losing early isn't entirely surprising for this team that has, for the most part, built their entire identity around Ice 1v5ing in the late game. It's not entirely shocking to see them not be particularly good early on. It's a big reason why I've criticized Sheo, is I just think he's way too slow as a jungler in this current meta. I understand that things are going later naturally, but I just don't know if it's a style that's going to work against the best teams in the world, and we're continuing to see them really struggle at being able to play through mid to late game situations when they're losing in gold basically every single game. It's just not good. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Nuke, though. I just felt like his mechanics were really bad in this game on the Corki. His laning was bad. His decision-making was awful. That solo kill that he got by Humanoid in the mid lane, halfway through the game, was, horrendously bad. I mean, just generally a couple of really awful plays from Nuke. I like him quite a bit, but he has best of 5 paralysis. I mean, this guy constantly underperforms in these best of 5s and in these big moments, and it's really held BDS back in the past, and it's happening once again. Ice and the Brav were pretty good here. They were able to get that early lead. Noah was donated a couple of kills in some skirmishes, which let him catch up and let him be useful in the back half of these games, but Ice and Lebrov did a great job. I don't think Sheo was particularly far behind. Cassante is going to be relevant regardless of his lack of gold. If you had a Corki in this game, I think something could have happened in the mid game, but you didn't. He was really bad and really ineffective. And then you compound on the fact that Adam continued to struggle as the game went on because you didn't really have any structure to play off of. And yeah, things got worse. And so for BDS, there is a bit of a concern that this team is just not good enough from a talent perspective to be able to take on even the best teams at the LEC level, which I think are weaker than a lot of the other regions at the moment. So a bit of a concern for BDS. Not a great showing in game one. And honestly, I do want to see more out of Fnatic throughout the rest of this series too. I'm still pretty pleased by the fact that they dominated the first half of the game. I just want to see more clean execution and more decision making in the second half to make it not so up for debate. I think better teams would have actually punished Fnatic more than BDS could have in this game. But we'll have to see how the series ends up, developing and transitioning here as we move in to game number 2. Can BDS even up the series, or is Fnatic going to take a dominating 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And the demolition continues here with them just being better in basically every facet. The mistakes made by BDS just getting compounded more and more egregiously, and now they're sitting in a spot where they got to win 3 in a row in order to stay in the upper bracket here in the season finals. If Fnatic can win this, depending, of course, on the outcome of the next series, they could qualify themselves for Worlds just based off this win. Certainly puts them in a pretty good spot to be top 3 guaranteed, and going up 2-0 is definitely a great start to that. Player of the game for me in game 2 is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. Clearly the choice here. I don't really think I considered anybody else. His team fighting was tremendous. His laning was tremendous. His ability to just punish every single mistake that Nuke was making was phenomenal. There's just not really a lot to say about Fnatic here. I wanted a more decisive game from them, and I kind of got it. It wasn't exactly the most decisive game of all time. BDS actually had an opportunity in the mid to late game around Baron, and they were able to get a few picks, and they were able to be in kind of the area for this to start happening, but getting your Baron stolen by Noah's bullet time is not really the best way to spend those resources that you were able to collect. It's really just all bad. We'll get to BDS, but, to Fnatic's credit, they took advantage of the weaknesses, but I guess my problem is that it doesn't really feel like it's more than that for Fnatic. It doesn't really feel like, oh, it's Fnatic going out there and making play after play after play. It's more so BDS going out there and making a play and then doing it wrong, and Fnatic just, taking advantage of that. That's really how it feels these games are going. And so pardon me if I'm really just not, super enthused by the gameplay. I think it's good. I'm glad that Fnatic's not really making any egregious errors. They're not throwing away advantages that they are able to generate early on in games, but I want to see more proactivity. I want to see this team do more than just say, well, you screwed up. Here's, us beating you. I don't really mean this in a way that's going to sound demeaning, but I'm sure LEC fans are going to see it as very demeaning. But, this is the same kind of game that we would criticize the LCS for so many years. It's just a game where both teams are just kind of there, and the team that makes more mistakes loses, and the team that plays really safe and boring and passive ends up winning. I know that feels like I'm being harsh, but it just kind of feels like where they are right now. Feels like they're afraid to make decisions. Now, when they do make them, they work. Again, Humanoid going in the mid lane looked great. Their full engage in the fight at the end of the game looked really good, but for Fnatic, I just want to see them actually just get this gigantic lead in the early game and then just fight, actually do something instead of waiting for BDS to initiate a fight down 5k gold, and it just feels very strange. I don't know. I want to see more aggressiveness. I hope I'm getting my point across and not sounding, annoying about it, but let me know down in the comments if it's making sense. For BDS on the other side, it's just tragic. This team played horrible in this game, quite frankly. A couple of players to really highlight. Nuke is the first one. He's going to get dud of the game. He's just not good, man. I don't know what to say. He was so good over the course of this whole year. In the regular seasons, he's generally been a huge positive, but these best of fives are just his kryptonite, and I can't really explain why it ends up working out like this. Shout out Goldborg in the pregame for saying that Nuke is the best solution in the LEC. I kind of agree with him. That's the crazy part. I'm not going to say he's better than Caps, because no one's better than Caps at anything in the LEC, but he has certainly played it more, and he has been probably a little bit more aggressive on it over the course of this year, but it all goes away in the season finals. It all goes away in these best of fives. Nuke does not play like Nuke anymore. Something gets in his head, and things just start to go wrong, and that's what we're seeing here. Sheo deserves a ridiculous amount of hate for this game. What were those those smites. I mean, losing a smite to a Misfortune bullet time is just completely unacceptable. Genuinely can't really explain what happened there. Not only that, but his team fighting was really poor. He was afraid to frontline as Sejuani. Like, it's your one job this game. And the problem I have with Sheo that I will continue to have is he's just so slow in the early game. He just really doesn't play super aggro. It's why I've not really considered him even for like the top 4 junglers in the LEC over the course of this year, because he just doesn't really make those aggressive decisions. He relies on the late game teamfights where he is really good, but it just doesn't feel like a consistent strategy. And Adam, he was so fed in this game. He's 4-0-0 at the beginning of this game on Camille. He could have done literally whatever he wanted, and whatever he wanted was engage onto the backline and instantly die every single team fight. It was so odd, the decision-making for BDS throughout this game. I honestly think they just played really bad. Ice and Labrov continue to be the only players that aren't completely running it at every single immediate opportunity, but Ice is on Ziggs. You took your best player and put him on Ziggs. Like, I just don't get it. Doesn't really make sense to me. BDS is now down 0-2, and I don't really have a lot of confidence that this team's gonna figure it out and come back better. For Fnatic, like, yes, they're beating BDS, but I wish I saw, like, more solid games. I wish I saw them dominate in the aggressive way that I want to see them dominate. I want to see them come out and just like force BDS to bow down. Now they still have a game to do that, and I can only be so critical of them destroying game number 2, but I really don't feel great about either of these teams coming out of this second game, so I'd love to see something different in game number 3. Can BDS keep this series alive, or is Fnatic going to sweep them out of the upper part of this bracket? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take the third and final game of this series. They're going to wrap it up with a clean 3-0 sweep. And honestly, this was probably their best game of the series. I know there are going to be some nitpicks. I think BDS had some interesting plays themselves. This was probably BDS's best game of the series, and Fnatic was still able to come out on top. I think their clean execution was a lot clearer in this game. I think, you know, it wasn't really the skirmish-happy game that I was kind of looking for, but this was a very proactive game in terms of them constantly doing something on the map, which is really all I'm asking them to do, is just be, you know, doing something, be gaining gold constantly, even if you have to trade for it, just do something on the map at all times, especially when you have a gigantic advantage, and that's what they were able to do in this one. It really felt like they kind of took a lot of the passiveness that they had been playing to heart and said, you know what, screw it, we're actually just going to go out there and do what we can do to just dominate and win. And that's really going to be a game changer for them. Again, proactivity will lead to this team being one of the scarier ones, not only in the LEC, because they already are, even kind of without it, but this could be a team that does something internationally if they can take that aggressiveness to heart. They have enough talent to be able to get that done, and this was a much better example of that. So we'll talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Razork for me. This was his best game of the series, pretty clearly to me on the Nidalee. This was really the only one where I felt like he was really just like deciding to dominate the game early. Mid lane was over, like within the first 5 minutes of the game. Humanoid and Razork just abused Nuke, and honestly kind of abused Sheo in the jungle matchup as well, and just tried to make sure that they were as far behind as possible going into the mid game. A lot of that was Razork, and I think he played the Nidalee very well. This was a great aggressive performance. This champion has performed very well in the LEC as of late. I think teams are getting more used to playing around its early game, and honestly, if you can get something like Yone or Kai'Sa really enabled from the Nidalee, then it's all worth it. It doesn't really matter how much she falls off in the late game in terms of her damage. I think Razork was also very good in terms of being in the right place in mid-game fights and in the back half of the game. All you really have to do is not be in the wrong place, and you're going to be in a pretty good spot. And Razork, I think, did a good job of that. But player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. Really did feel like he was the most important piece of Fnatic here, and I really would be shocked if others thought differently. I think Razork ended up getting voted player of the series, but to me, it was pretty clearly Humanoid. I thought he was the best across this. Mid gap was just absolutely ginormous here. Not that jungle gap wasn't. It really was also rather large, but I mean, the mid gap was an absolute canyon over the course of this series. Humanoid was so much better than Nuke in all 3 games. Nuke was a major issue for BDS throughout this entire series, and Humanoid was just awesome at being able to take advantage of that. The Yone did look a bit more, I guess, risky than some of the other picks, like the Azir that he's pulled out in this series, but you still can't complain too much about a game that, you know, he was 2-0-0 in at like 5 minutes and was basically unstoppable the rest of the way. He just dominated lane and out of lane every single game. He was awesome and definitely the best player on Fnatic in my opinion. Noah and Jun also had a pretty good series, and that's with Ice and Labrov very much not being the problem on the side of BDS. Both of them actually had very good series. We'll get to that when we talk about BDS. I feel pretty bad for both of them because I think they both tried their best in this series, but Noah and Jun were also solid. Oscar did a couple of good things, even if I didn't think he was all that important towards the series outcome. This was the middle of the map. We talked about that being such a big factor for Fnatic, that being their two most important and best players, and they really came in clutch in this series to really drive it home for Fnatic. And then for BDS, Nuke is going to get dud of the game. That's 3 straight duds of the game for him across this series. I don't really know what to say. The best of 5 curse on Nuke is very real. Typically speaking, it has been mostly against G2, but that's honestly mostly because BDS has basically only faced G2 in best of 5s, but BDS and Nuke in general have just never really been all that good in best of 5s, and I don't really know if it's mental. I don't really know if the longer days end up taking a toll on him mentally. Like, I don't know what it is. Perhaps it's just him finally going up against competition that's locking in. A lot of mid laners in the LEC are pretty notoriously finicky, if you will. They can be pretty hit or miss over the course of the regular season. Some of them don't lock in until these best of 5s. Humanoid is a really good example of that, and I think Nuke could potentially just struggle when mid laners actually try. That could potentially be the case. There are a lot of different factors, but he was definitely the downside of this team, because Ice and LeBron were fine over the course of this series. Adam actually played really well here in game number 3. I thought the Ornn was awesome. Easily the best player on BDS in this game. It just didn't really amount to anything. It didn't matter really at all. Sheo was awful in the early game. Tried to salvage some things in the late game with some good fights on Lilia, but at the end of the day, he also got completely gapped by Razork on the other side. It was the middle of the map that ended up letting BDS down, and I hate to say it, it's not entirely surprising to expect that. When we previewed this series, we talked about, middle of the map being in favor of Fnatic and bot lane being in favor of BDS. If you can get Ice going and try to get him to win team fights, BDS is actually probably able to beat a team like Fnatic, but if you're not able to get to that stage consistently, then you really have no shot, especially when Razork and Humanoid were playing as well as they did here today. So BDS now moves into the lower bracket. They now move down to take on, well, depending on who ends up winning or losing the next series, they will either take on Giant X or they will take on SK Gaming. Both matchups they should be favorites in. They've beaten both of these teams over the course of this year, and so you would imagine that they would be able to get the job done against both, but this severely hampers their chances of making Worlds, and it certainly makes it a lot more difficult of a road for them. Not that this is a shocking outcome. This isn't an upset. Them going down into the lower bracket is what was expected the whole time, but going down as decisively as they did is certainly not ideal. For Fnatic, this moves them on to winners finals immediately into round number 3. This means that, again, depending on the outcome later on in the day, they could either be guaranteed a top 3 spot or be guaranteed a world spot already. That might be enough. Like, they're guaranteed top 3. That's going to happen no matter what, but whether or not that means they're already at Worlds depends on if G2 makes top 3, because G2's already qualified for Worlds, being the Summer Split champions. If G2 ends up in the top 3, then it's the other 2 in the top 3 that end up making Worlds. If G2 ends up missing top 3, then it is number 1 and 2 specifically that end up making Worlds. And so theoretically, it's all dependent on what happens in the next series, but at the very least, Fnatic have put themselves in the best possible position to end up qualifying for Worlds, and it isn't really a surprise. This absolutely should be a Worlds caliber team. At times, they very much, kind of wavered on whether or not they've actually lived up to that kind of hype, but at least over the course of the last couple of months, they've clearly looked like, at the very worst, the second best team in the LEC. But then moving on to our second upper bracket round number 1 series, and this one definitely at least a little bit less interesting on paper, certainly one that I expect to be a blowout, or at least that was the anticipation going in. It's the number 1 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 4 seeded Mad Lions Koi. These two teams are coming from very different directions in the summer split. G2, obviously, you're back-to-back-to-back-to-back champions in the LEC 4 times in a row, 5 of the last 6 over the last 2 years, and ever since the format change, they have dominated everything. Really, technically, it's 6 of the last 7, if you want to count the season finals last year as well. It's just been utter domination from G2. We've never seen a team be this successful across this long of a stretch in the league. Obviously, G2, Fnatic, teams have had their runs before where they've looked very good over 2-year stretches. I cannot remember a time where it was ever this not close, at least in terms of results. You can talk about how, Fnatic at times has looked close, even teams like BDS or Mad Lions have looked close at times, but in terms of the actual on the Rift results, nobody's been able to touch G2 outside of that one random Fnatic series where, I don't know what happened. They just stopped trying in game number 5, but in the games that matter, in the games that they're clearly locked in for, they're just so much better than everybody else in the LEC. And the frustrating part is it doesn't even really feel like it's all of G2. Yes, I think that there are good members on this team. I think Yike has had a great year. I think Broken Blade has probably been the best top laner in the LEC, but G2 is Caps. Like, that is really what it has become. He is the best player in the LEC, and it's not even just like him and then a tier gap and everyone else. Genuinely, at least from my perspective, from an importance standpoint and, you know, from a best case standpoint, it's Caps and then like 2 tier gaps and then everybody else. That's how much better he has been than everybody, and more important, he has been than everybody over the course of this year. He's not played perfect in every single game, but the games he does do well in, it's literally unlosable. He can 1v9. He could have like iron teammates, I think, in the LEC, and the games that he plays well in, I genuinely just think they're completely unlosable for him. That's how good he has been over the course of this year. The bot lane has struggled for the most part over the course of this year. Hans, I think, has generally been okay. He's been meh in the regular season, but in the best of fives, he's performed a lot better. Mickey X had a really good MSI, and people who only watched MSI will tell you that Mickey X was actually really good this year. And then if you watched any of the LEC, but specifically me who watched all of the LEC, I can sit here and tell you that this was a pretty bad year, all things considered, from Mickey. He definitely subtracted more wins from this team than he did add over the course of this year. If they had a different, more average support, they probably would have been even more dominant, but, you know, Mickey had a good MSI, so what do I know? Obviously, that's more important than 7 months of games. I joke, I jest, but it's really Caps. Like, he's the one carrying this team across the finish line, and obviously he's going to make them favorites in any series, but they're not unbeatable. Mad Lions, though, I just don't know if they're the team that's going to be able to beat G2. They're pretty lucky to be here in the first place. They needed some luck to go their way in order to not only make playoffs, but make the season finals, and that luck ended up going their way. They had enough championship points for making the finals in the winter split to be able to qualify, but this team is in complete freefall mode, at least in terms of the results recently. This team has basically stopped going to their weird off-meta picks and has started playing meta, and everything has completely fallen apart. I think Supa and Alvaro have generally been fine for this team. Supa is certainly someone that's good enough to be able to win early and translate that into wins. Alvaro, very active support, but the top side of this map was just horrific down the stretch. I'm not saying that they're horrible players. I'm a big fan of Elyoya. I've called him the #1 jungler in Europe for quite a while now, but he was awful down the stretch of the regular season. Mirwin is somebody who I have pretty heavily pushed back on in terms of the hype. He's been really good at these off-meta champions, and the moment that he has to play anything even remotely meta, he just gets destroyed. I've always said he is what everybody pretends Adam is, where he just can only really play the off-meta picks. And then Frescowy had a great start to his LEC career, but he has been getting absolutely dominated in lane as of recent. I think the mid lane pool has just gotten better over the course of the year, and Frescowy has definitely dropped in terms of the rankings of it, but a lot of Mad's success is gonna have to come off the back of either of these players just turning it around, which I think is possible. Elyoya could always have a good series. This guy is a ridiculously good player. You know, Mirwin can surprise people. Frescowy has played well in best of fives in the past, or more specifically, the bot lane likely stepping up and being better than the weak link, quote unquote, of G2, with Hans and Mickey taking advantage of Mickey's, you know, once a game int that he does that completely throws off all the timers for G2. If they can do that more consistently, perhaps they can win a game. I don't think the expectation for them is all that high, though, especially with Fnatic sweeping BDS. It's really hard to come into this series and say that this is, like, closer on paper. I think the expectation is that this is going to be a sweep and a quick one for G2. And so we'll see if it ends up living up to that, or if Mad Lions can actually surprise us. But, you know, going game by game, we get to start with game #1, and the winner of game #1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take the first game of the series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is actually kind of a good sign. Typically speaking, G2, if they're ever going to throw a random game in the series, it's game 1. If they've ever been beatable, it's game 1s throughout this year. I don't know why, but game 1 has always been a bit more meh for them in terms of getting comfortable in a series, so if they're coming out and getting a dominating 27-minute win in game #1, that's a pretty good sign for G2, all things considered. This was not a particularly close game. Mad Lions did want to pull out some of the crazier picks as real mid has become a bit more commonplace, but Lulu top, certainly not something we're seeing out of a lot of other teams. Mirwin, obviously a lot more comfortable on these weird off-meta picks. I'm totally fine with Mad Lions going towards them, if only because at the beginning of the year I was like, well, I think they'd be better off if Mirwin was just good at the meta picks, and I agree, they would be better off if he was good at the meta picks, but he's not good at the meta picks, so we might as well pick the weird stuff that he is able to surprise people with. Unfortunately, it didn't even really work here. I think Mad drafted this, like, Exodia embody a teamfight comp and just never even remotely tried to play towards it. They spent the entirety of the early game skirmishing and just not allowing Smolder or Ezreal or Lulu to ever try to get into these front-to-back 5v5s. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I don't really understand the purpose of drafting this team comp and then trying to fight a ton in the early game when you're going into Kalista and Rel and Vi. Like, again, it's just completely baffling. It's horrible decision-making, but that's kind of been the crux of Mad Lions over the past couple of weeks, is that they are very talented. They just don't really have the decision-making in order to back that up. For G2, I think they played fine. I really wasn't like ridiculously blown away by them, but I think that they were very, very difficult to take advantages off of. They were not a team that was going to just make a mistake and give things over. They were very clinical, and honestly, towards the back half of this game, they had phenomenal execution. It just wasn't the flashiest game in the world. I think this was exactly how you would draw it up if you're G2. Player of the game could go to basically anybody. This was kind of a romp on the side of G2, and so all 5 members ended up being pretty effective, but I'm going to give it to Caps in the mid lane. Just felt like he was the most noticeable in terms of the plays that he was making. The damage in the late game team fights on the Azir, I think, was definitely the most noticeable, but Hans, Mickey, I think both of them absolutely have a case to be player of the game as well. Mickey in particular, I thought looked pretty good here on the Rel. Most specifically in the late game, I thought that those engages were actually very important and really sealed the fate of Mad Lions around 20-21 minutes, so that's a good thing for them, but G2, for the most part, just kind of got a team win here. Yike was pretty solid on the Vi, definitely completely outjungled the Maokai on the other side of this matchup. Never really a good thing to be able to say, but Caps looked awesome. I just think his mechanics on Azir are ridiculous. He's completely outplayed Fresskowy almost every single time that these two have played each other. Not that he hasn't done that to basically everybody that he's played against, but specifically to these young mid laners like Nuke and Fresskowy that maybe don't have the same kind of experience as someone like a Humanoid. Like, he really takes advantage of those players, and it's become very comical to see. The only player that I didn't really consider for player of the game was Broken Blade on the top side. It's only because he didn't really do anything. He took a couple of trades with Mirwin in the 1v1, you know, traded out for ult a couple of times, nobody ever died, and just kind of played the team fights. Like, he's Kennen, he did his job, but he wasn't particularly relevant over the course of this game. This was mostly just kind of a team effort in the middle of the map and then bringing the bot lane into it. So congrats to G2, very dominating win in game number 1, and for Mad, this is exactly what we highlighted. This is the middle of the map getting absolutely destroyed, Elyoya and Fresskowy just not being able to hold up at all against G2, and unfortunately Supa and Alvaro not really being able to do anything about it. Supa on Smolder, you know, people are going to flame him because haha, funny quote, but what is he supposed to do in this game? You're playing Smolder and the rest of your team is constantly just looking for skirmishes and dying. You can't help them. Like, you can't do anything. You gotta wait till you're level 11 to even be a champion in the first place, and so don't really understand what the idea was for Mad. I don't really blame the bot lane. I kind of blame Alvaro for going in really aggressively, but it's hard for me to blame Supa just in this particular instance. Mirwin was also fine on the top side. The pick looked fine enough in lane, but you're picking Lulu for the front-to-back team fight. Like, that's the reason lane Lulu exists, whether top or mid, and the fact that you just completely abandoned that game plan and play style the moment you got into the game is just genuinely hilarious and kind of ridiculous. And so Elyoya, pretty easy choice for dead of the game. Accomplished, I'm not going to say basically nothing, accomplished nothing over the course of this game. Constantly died and had a horrible game plan. The execution was bad. I'm a big fan of Elyoya. I generally think that this narrative that, oh, Elyoya was so stupid to bring in a bunch of rookies. Look at how well it turned out. You know, I've said a couple of times on this channel, if anybody's watched a lot of my LEC content, I'm sure if you're here, some of you at least have, hopefully, I think it's absurd, the reception that Mad Lions has gotten. I think generally LEC fans are very reactionary. Every single year you hear the same thing peddled. Oh, insert 10th place team here is so dumb, they should be kicked out of the league, it's absurd. Even though all of them, for the most part, had like interesting rosters on paper that just didn't work out. I think Mad is the example of it this year, where it's like, oh, look at how stupid Elyoya was for bringing a bunch of rookies in. How's that dream team working out, Elyoya? And pretty well, they went to finals. I honestly don't think that it's going all that poorly. They're the number 4 seed in the season finals, and I get it, they're not looking good right now, and Elyoya is playing poorly, but generally the reception and the reaction to Mad Lions, I think it's been absolutely ludicrous and just utterly ignorant from the community, as I've stated in the past. That being said, Elyoya was awful here in game number 1, and he's got to be better. Fresskowy was also not good enough here on the Ezreal. Again, he's got to step up. Caps is not an easy opposition to try to play into, but at the very least, he has to give it a shot. If Mirwin can pull out some of these more interesting picks, and if they can actually try to utilize them in terms of their comp, perhaps they have something here. But at least for now, if the middle of the map keeps getting destroyed, it's basically the same thing we said about BDS. There's no real way to recover that right now in this meta. So Mad's got to win game number 2. You can't go down 0-2 to G2. That's a death sentence. But for G2, if you can take that 2-0 series lead, you can probably coast yourself into a victory just based off of the mental factor alone, as we've seen in a lot of these best of 5. So which one is going to happen? Is Mad going to be able to tie the series up, or is G2 going to be able to take that commanding lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a series on our hands. It is going to a tied game 3, and that is infinitely more interesting, but what is probably the most interesting thing that we got out of this game is just how Mad Lions actually ended up winning this series. It wasn't a stomp. They didn't dominate this game because of the weird Corki top and Vex mid, and G2 just didn't know what to do against it, and they had no answers. No, G2 had a great foothold in this game, and they just couldn't quite close it out, which kind of is the story of the LEC right now when you really think about it, is teams just not being able to actually close out games, and Mad Lions being better in terms of the execution in the back half of this game. There were multiple moments that G2 had that could secure them the win, that would instantly end the game, and they couldn't actually take any of them because Mad ended up just being better in those situations. Did they make some mistakes? Absolutely, but this was a super encouraging game for Mad Lions, and I'm excited to talk about it. Player of the game, it's obvious. It's got to go to Mirwin in the top lane on the Corki. We're not seeing a lot of Corki top. I don't necessarily think it's the craziest thing in the world. Like, we've seen Mirwin pull out weirder things. I think the Lulu top in the previous game is actually way stranger, way harder than Corki top. We've seen this a bit in the LPL. It's something that is playable, in my opinion, especially into something like Kennen, because the whole point of Kennen right now is that you should have enough gold to just be able to run into fights and do whatever you need to do in the first 2 seconds. If that's not the case, then he is very burstable and he's very exhaustible. Well, that is if Alvaro actually took exhaust in this game, but I digress. Mirwin was, you know, pretty solid in the laning phase, was definitely ahead, and then completely took over in the late game team fights. When you're looking for a damage carry, that's exactly what Mirwin was. But one of the players that I really don't want to go under the radar from this performance is Frescowy in the mid lane, who I thought played excellent on the Vex. Now, maybe it's because I'm a Vex player, maybe that's where I'm coming at this from, and I don't get to see this champion in pro all that much, but finally getting to see it on a big stage, it's very clear when players like know what they're doing with Vex and have put a lot of time into her individually. I think the most important play for me, obviously the early stuff was great, and some of the later team fights were not quite as perfect, but that's where Vex falls off generally anyways. Really, the moment that kind of stood out to me is when Kennen was going over the wall in an attempt to get that flank ultimate. Frescowy perfectly times the kind of jump over and actually lands the fear, gets him out in front of Corki, and instantly deletes him. It's a game-saving play, and I don't think a lot of people actually recognize that Frescowy ended up making that. Just really a beautiful Vex game. Like, there were some mistakes in terms of being pushed up a little bit too much just in terms of the macro of it, but I think he actually played the champion well, and the champion was very valuable in this game. Elyoya on Morgana I thought was fine, but Supa and Alvaro, they were both up and down. I think Supa generally was fine this game. His performance is going to go a bit under the radar because people hate him, but he was fine. He wasn't the carry. He didn't have to be in this one. And then Alvaro, again, the biggest problem for him is he didn't take exhaust, and that was kind of a brutal problem for them in a couple of team fights in this game. If he had taken exhaust, this game would not have been particularly close, in my opinion, but he didn't, and so the game was. Alvaro was definitely going to get yelled at in the back for that, or at least I imagine he will be, but at the end of the day, the solo laners came up clutch, and they needed to. They're the two players we've been talking about needing to step up for Mad, alongside Elyoya, of course, but getting 2 of 3 isn't bad here in game 2. And then for G2 on the other side, just bad execution down the stretch. I don't think they individually played horrible. Like, you wanted some better performances, specifically out of Caps in some of these late game team fights, because he's Caps and you're kind of expecting him to not make mistakes like he did, but at the end of the day, you should still be able to win with the mistakes that you made. You just weren't. I think Mad Lions ended up outplaying you. Broken Blade's gonna get dud of the game for me, outside of 1 actually influential ult, maybe 2 actually influential ults. Broken Blade didn't really do anything this game, and his lack of taking over these team fights is actually kind of what cost G2. Their entire structure and game plan in these 5v5s was almost entirely around making sure Kennen was in a good spot, and he wasn't. Like, he just never was able to actually get those massive ultimates off. I mean, there was 1 fight, but outside of that, he was stopped every single time, and that's what lost G2 the game. And so even if I don't think it was entirely Broken Blade's fault that he was in that situation, he is a little bit to blame for the fact that this game didn't end up working out for them. I think Hans also getting caught out early on in the final fight is horrendous and pretty much unacceptable from the Kai'Sa, diving the backline for no no reason. I mean, they had the gold to be able to try to win that, even if it would have been difficult. Hans made a couple of positioning mistakes. Mickey X was just a little bit overeager. Thought he did a good job dancing in terms of the aggressiveness throughout the game, but sometimes he would let his carry die for absolutely no reason, and it's frustrating from my standpoint. Yike also wasn't perfect, but G2 probably should have won this game. If they were as clinical as we expect them to be, if Caps had showed up, if you had gotten good performances in these final fights out of Hans and Yike and Broken Blade, I think they win this game, and the fact that they didn't means that Mad Lions just kind of outplayed them, which is certainly at least a bit concerning, but you have to hope they can bounce back here in game number 3. It's all tied up. We're basically entering a best of 3 now. Winning game number 3, as you know, is in my opinion the most important game in this series. Not having to win both of the final 2 games really takes a lot of pressure off your back. So game 3, very big for both of these teams. Which one is going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to regain control of this series by going up 2-1. And what a banger here in game number 3. Easily the most fun game of the weekend. Really a back and forth affair from both of these teams where both of them looked like they could take it really at any point. Mad Lions was like 1 or 2 autos away from ending the game at 30 minutes. They couldn't quite get it on the Nexus, and they end up not being able to win it in the end. It was ridiculously close. It's honestly kind of encouraging for both teams this game because both of them had to do things that were outside of their own comfort zones in order to stay alive, really at both points. I thought Mad Lions played excellent, and quite frankly, like I said, they probably could have won this game. Micro little movement decisions maybe end up changing this for the better in their favor, but those are the kinds of things you can't really like plan or account for, or you can't really like coach out of players. It's just not possible. Even the best players of all time are still going to not be perfect on every single click. And so when you're thinking about it, like Mad probably should have won this game, but when they didn't, they made a couple of mistakes in the back half of some of these fights, some more major than others that we will talk about. And G2 was able to capitalize on the gold that they actually were able to accumulate earlier on. Those lost fights didn't end up mattering too much, and really G2 won when it mattered the most. But again, I don't want anybody to walk away from this feeling bad about really any of these 10 players. This was a great game from all 10 of the players on the Rift, and that's what made it so difficult to try to give a player and a dud of the game in this one, because genuinely I think everybody played well, and I don't think anybody played exceptionally like better than everybody else. I am going to give player of the game to Hansama, if only because the Draven was certainly the most active and important member of G2. I don't think he necessarily individually played the best of anybody in the game, but he certainly was the most relevant because he was the one with all the gold. All he had to do was stay alive and get those auto attacks off, and if he could do that, then he would be able to blow up basically anybody on the side of Mad Lions, Galio and Nautilus really notwithstanding. But Hans was pretty good, definitely in the early game. That skirmish, that 4v4 essentially down towards the bottom side of the map, was super important to get that Draven rolling, and he never really looked back. He was very impressive, but he would have been nowhere without the initiations and the help that he got from the rest of the team. Mickey X is having a pretty good day here. This time on the Rel, I thought he was pretty good in this game. Caps was pretty excellent on the Annie, was only really inconsequential when the champion was going to be generally inconsequential. I actually thought he played game number 3 really well, all things considered. Yikes engages were important. Broken Blade had multiple massive Kennen ultimates, something he really didn't have all that consistently at the beginning part of this series. Just a really good game for G2. I thought they had really good execution, especially after like the 35-minute mark. That's where they really started to kick into gear, but I don't want that to be taking anything away from Mad Lions, who again, I want to reiterate, probably should have won this game and kind of had it in the bag. I think people are going to talk about this as if, you know, Mad is some sort of team that couldn't hang on and that the experience kind of cost them. This is a great showing for Mad Lions. Not only did they take a game off of G2 in game 2, but they were able to basically kind of win game 3 as well, just not get the actual win. It's really impressive stuff from a team that I think a lot of people counted out. There were just a couple of moments down the stretch that really ended up costing them. Dead of the game for me was impossible, as I said at the beginning. I don't really think anybody deserves dead of the game. I'm going to reiterate that, like, nobody deserves it. And I honestly think that, really, at the end of the day, if I were willing to not give someone the award, this would probably be the game to do it. But I always do, and so I am going to give it to Supa. If only because he was probably the least remarkable of all of the players. He makes one bad arcane shift down the stretch of this game. That's unfortunately with how everyone else played enough to be able to get him dud of the game, because the other player who made more egregious mistakes on his team was also the one they were rallying behind to try to win the game, and that is Mirwin in the top lane on the Zeri. It's really weird because I think Supa's mistakes were significantly less bad than Mirwin's. I think Mirwin made 2 mistakes in this game that were literally like insta-game losing, and they both really cost them in the end. again, but they were only really in that spot because Mirwin was really far ahead on the Zeri and was able to do a lot of damage in these 5v5s, and so it makes it a lot trickier. I definitely considered him for dud of the game because, again, his mistakes were the most egregious in the entire game, and I do believe that they lost Mad Lions the game, but I can't really say that they would have been in the game without him. So take with that what you will. Supa's going to get it because his highs were just a little bit lower, even if his lows were definitely a bit higher than Mirwin's. But Elyoya, Fresskowy, Alvaro, Supa, and Mirwin, like, they all played really well in this game. Elyoya had a couple of really clutch black shields, and the bindings were actually on point this game from him. Great skill shot accuracy. Fresskowy was incredibly valuable on the Galio, probably the most valuable player on Mad Lions, and Alvaro hit a couple of really important hooks on the Nautilus. His peel was also just generally great. He couldn't die in some of these fights with how he was juggling aggro. So really impressive stuff from Mad, from G2. This was just a good game all around. And I don't think either team really has a lot to be disappointed in, but G2 is going to walk out of it up 2-1 in this series. Are they going to be able to close it out in 4, or is Mad Lions going to continue this hot streak that they're kind of on right now and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and maybe shockingly, we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Things have really turned here for G2. They're now going into game number 5 having dropped game 4, and honestly, kind of having dropped all 3 of the last 3 games. This has kind of been a 3-1 in favor of Mad. Unfortunately for them, they weren't actually able to close out that game 3, and so, you know, they'll just have to take this 2-2 series lead at the moment, but they have looked pretty great over the second half of this series, and G2 is certainly showing some problems. This was easily their worst game of the series up until this point. This is the bad version of G2. This is the version that lost to Fnatic in the playoffs. This is the version that just can't really seem to find any sort of combo that actually works. This draft is crazy. Nocturne Orianna in 2024 is crazy. Both of those champions are incredibly underpowered. Orianna in particular right now is just in a really bad spot. She does no damage, and really her shielding is not useful in any way, and so when Mad ends up picking up 380 carries versus 1, yeah, you can bet that they ended up winning the game in the current state. Now, obviously it's a lot more complicated than that, but we'll get into it as we talk about it. Player of the game for me, it's gotta go to Elyoya. Like, I didn't really have to think about this really for more than 2 seconds. Fresskowy was definitely in the running for me. Alvaro, I thought, had a really good game on the Braum. Mirwin was the most influential damage threat down the stretch, but, you know, he got caught left and right, so I really wasn't considering him. At the end of the day, this was Elyoya's award to win. This is the best game that he has played in months. Like, genuinely, this was the first time I was like, oh, there's the Elyoya I remember. There's the multiple-time LEC champion that I remember, the former Rookie of the Year, the perennial MVP candidate. That's the player that I was waiting for. This was an elite Vi game, like one of those that you really only see out of one of the better players in the league. He was everywhere on the map. He was never making mistakes, constantly going in at the right time, on the right targets, juggling aggro well, moving in and out of fights. Like, this was just an elite level Vi game that, you know, a week ago, I don't know if Elyoya gives you this. I don't think that he gives you this 2 weeks ago at the end of the regular season, or the end of the playoffs, I should say. I just don't think you're getting that out of Elyoya. This is a reinvigorated version of him, and I think a lot of that has come from the fact that this team has fought so hard throughout this series up until this point. So great game number 4 from him. Like I said, Fresskowy was also awesome on the Zeri. It's kind of interesting. I thought that these were going to get switched in draft. I think G2 obviously thought these were going to get switched as well, with the Zeri going top and the Smolder going mid. But alas, here we are with this configuration. Technically, all 3 of them are triple flexes. I would be shocked if we saw Ezreal top. I think that takes away a lot of the positives of Ezreal, but, you know, Smolder top definitely works. Zeri mid definitely works here, and Fresskowy is clearly comfortable on the Zeri at the moment, because this just was a great team fighting game from him. He was constantly in and out of the action, never in danger, and doing a billion damage. Supa goes deathless in this one. I thought he was excellent in these fights. He really was never overextending, I should say. He realized that Smolder and Zeri were going to play a lot more aggressive, and because of that, Zeri in particular, he was willing to take the role of, okay, I'm Ezreal. If I just sit back and poke for the beginning part of the fight, if they go in and do a bunch of damage and blow everybody up, I can finish every single fight, and that's exactly what Supa did. Great game plan, and they executed it well, and then Alvaro was great on the Braum to try and do everything he could to make that last as long as possible, to make Zeri and Smolder up as long as possible. You know, Mirwin, again, was in the running for player of the game because the damage was off the charts in the back half, but he got picked like 4 or 5 times in side lanes for no reason in this game, so I can only be so forgiving of the negative plays. It's so funny because Mirwin, I think, has been such a star through the first 4 games of this series, but the problems that he's had all year are still there. He's just actually having good plays alongside of it to kind of complement that, but the mistakes, like, they're not going away. He's still the same flippy, inconsistent player. It's just all wrapped up in this very intriguing package through the first 4 games, and so very interesting to talk about, but big win for Mad to push us to Game 5, and for G2, this has got to feel kind of bad. I'm going to be honest. Like, this was not a close game. This was probably the biggest blowout since game number 1, and a lot of the bad G2 mistakes ended up coming back here. The horrible early game was very prevalent in this one, and mostly on Mickey X. He's going to get out of the game. I've received some criticism for disliking Mickey X. I just don't understand why. Like, I mean, I would get it if I was saying, like, Mickey X has been a bad player over the course of his career. Obviously, that's not the case. The guy was an MVP frontrunner, was my MVP last year, and, you know, has been a superstar player for top-tier teams for quite a long time, but if you're looking at the 2024 tape, unless you have exclusively watched MSI, there's just no reasonable way you can convince me that Mickey X has had a good year. Like, there is no tape in the LEC that makes me think this guy's a top 5 support at the LEC level right now, and the crazy thing is I still expect him to bounce back, and I still expect him to be fine, but every once in a while you get a game like this where it's like, it's impossible to win the early game with Mickey X. Like, there are just times where he literally makes it impossible to win the early game. He gives free kills over to the Zeri. He lets the entire enemy team completely snowball the game out of control. Like, it's just miserably bad, and I don't really know how to explain it. He wasn't better in the back half of the game, mind you, and then Yike is the other player with just weird mistakes, ulting Vi, like, basically every single time he had Nocturne ult up. Like, I just don't understand. It just feels like such a simple mistake that you have to be able to fix, and he just really wasn't able to do that. I don't know what was going on. Broken Blade wasn't particularly useful on the Cassante. In fact, I completely forgot he was in the game. Caps playing Ori. Again, the biggest problem here is just the champion selection. He was entirely useless. He was doing no damage and was offering basically no utility because that champion is just in a really bad spot. So I really don't know why they picked it. Hans was there on the Kai'Sa, but this was Mad Lions dominating the game and winning off the back of them being better, and now you're going into a Game 5. This has already kind of been a 3-1 in favor of Mad. Can they take Game 5 and pull off this gigantic upset, kind of being the better team in this series, or is G2 gonna calm the storm, calm things down, and end up winning game number 5 anyways? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Mad Lions. They are gonna take game number 5. They are somehow, some way gonna walk out of this series with a win, and they are moving on to the winners finals of the season finals here in the LEC. This certainly makes things a lot more interesting. This felt like the most obvious selection in the entire bracket. G2, of course they were gonna beat Mad Lions. Of course they were gonna move on to winners finals. That meant that Fnatic would be qualifying by the end of the weekend for Worlds because they're guaranteed top 3, and that means with G2 in the top 3 that they're in Worlds. You know how that works, and you know, everything would have been hunky-dory. Mad Lions would go down to the lower bracket, maybe pick up a win or two, but not really make a lot of impact. No, here we are. We're walking out of the series. Not only did Mad Lions win, they kind of 4-1'd G2. Like, game number 3, they were literally 1 or 2 autos away from ending the game. I mean, as specific as I could possibly make that, there is no reason to believe that Mad Lions was not just straight up the better team in this series, which is unfreaking believable. I don't know what's going on with G2 right now, but it's a problem. Like, they did not play well in this game. They didn't play well at all over the last 2 games of this series, and Mad Lions did. I know they have some unique picks. I know people are going to point out the Nidalee top and say that's the reason they won is because they picked wacky stuff and G2 wasn't prepared for it, but honestly, like, they didn't struggle with Nidalee as a champion. They struggled with actually playing around their own win conditions, and the Nidalee happened to be very effective in Mad Lions' win condition. I don't think this is just, oh, well, they didn't have an answer to Nidalee. Like, legitimately, I'm looking at this game and I'm saying G2 was worse, like, in basically every aspect, and that was the same as game number 4, so certainly something to analyze there, but player of the game and player of the series is going to go to Mirwin in the top lane. Honestly, I went back and forth on this, if only because I think Mirwin made so many bad plays over the course of this series, but he also made all of the good plays, like the best plays that Mad Lions had. Just kind of the dichotomy you have to live with if you're a Mad Lions fan, and if you like Mirwin, you're going to have to take the good with the bad. For the most part, at least in this series, it ended up really working out for you. The Nidalee was great, but all of the crazy picks. He didn't have a single game this series where he played like an actual real top laner, and that's how you would want it to be. Like, that's the dream, right? Is having Mirwin just on all of these off-meta picks that his opponents aren't very comfortable playing into, and then you can utilize them in the late game. The Nidalee very much worked out, something that is a bit more traditional in terms of going up to a solo lane and actually working out. This is something that we've seen, obviously, very historically, you know, Hotshot GG and all, but it was funny. I think someone posted a stat on Twitter where it was like the last time Nidalee and Aurelia played against each other was like 2014 or 2015 in the top lane matchup, something like that. It's been forever. It's been like a decade since the last time we saw these two go head-to-head in a top lane matchup. Very funny how that ended up working out, but Mirwin was the one making a lot of the aggressive plays. Now, I do think he's getting a lot more praise than maybe he deserves in terms of just the like 1v9 comments. That's where I start to be like, I don't agree with that. I do not think this was a 1v9. I think that's incredibly disrespectful to his teammates, who I thought were really good in this series. Elyoya and Fresskowy really stepping up here in Game 5. Both of them were excellent in Game 4. I very much considered giving both of them player of the game here because I think they were equally as effective as the Nidalee, but I just thought it was a little bit more stylish to do it on something like a Nidalee top, and I understand why. He's definitely the one you want to point out. Elyoya was very good, though. Going deathless on Vi in a game like this is not easy. Fresskowy was amazing on the Ahri, constantly dashing in and out of action, doing a ton of damage, perfectly using a lot of his mobility, including Flash, like just everything you could have wanted out of the mid lane. And the concern about this team, the parts of the team that were kind of dragging them down in the playoffs and in the summer split regular season, the top side of the map, Mirwin, Elyoya, Fresskowy, they were the three best players on the team in this series. Not to say that Supa and Alvaro were bad. I think a lot of people just like to pretend that they're bad because it helps fit their narrative a bit better, and I will continue to say that the hate for Supa is entirely laughable. He's one of the most fun young players in the entire league, and if there's anything that I've learned, it's that LEC fans do not want actual players that are fun in their league, so Supa's just going to be hated for that, but they were fine this series. I know people are going to point to the Zeri Braum and say they weren't perfect here. This was probably one of their weaker games. They were awesome throughout most of the rest of this series, but Mad Lions moving on to winners finals to take on Fnatic. That is an intriguing matchup that I'm excited to preview, but for G2 on the other side, they dropped down to the lower bracket here. This is not something I anticipated, and this makes qualification a lot more interesting, not only for G2, because obviously they're already qualified for Worlds. They honestly don't even need to win any of these series. This is all superfluous for them, so it's really hard to take it entirely seriously for them, but you know, more so from a confidence perspective, this team has not really looked all that sharp in the past couple of months, and I would bet to wager, like, at least for my analysis, this team has gotten worse and worse and worse, basically the more that they have played, which is very concerning. Caps is actually going to get dud of the game here in game number 5. When you look at games 4 and 5, I understand why there are so many, like, craps comments coming out about this series, because in the two most important games, he played really bad. He was not relevant last game on the Orianna, although, as I said, I think a lot of that can be attributed to the champion rather than the player, but he was awful on the Azir, a champion that should be doing a lot more here, so he's got to pick it up. He was a little bit rough down the stretch of the summer playoffs as well. He just needs to be more clinical, but it's not just him. I thought, you know, Yike was pretty poor throughout majority of this series, and he has certainly been a pretty major question mark. Mickey X makes some really questionable engages, although I think he played significantly better than his scoreline would entail here in game 5. Hans on the Draven couldn't quite carry. Broken Blade wasn't exactly all that strong into the Nidalee. It wasn't exactly the R5 counterpick they were looking for. There were more problems with G2 than just Caps not playing well, but I think that's the one you have to highlight, because if Caps was playing well, then maybe none of the other problems actually end up mattering. It's certainly an interesting conversation to have, but G2 moving down to the lower bracket certainly creates some opportunities. It means nobody actually qualified for Worlds this weekend. The two teams that are in winners finals, technically there is a world if G2 doesn't get into the top 3, where either of them could miss Worlds, depending on who ends up losing that winners final series. If G2 somehow gets like 4th or 5th or 6th place or something like that here in the season finals, then whoever gets top 2 will end up making Worlds, and that means if you lose winners finals and then lose losers finals, then you don't make Worlds. So it's crazy how things ended up working out. This is certainly the most intriguing outcome in terms of the variables in this tournament, but probably the most shocking outcome we could have possibly gotten. It opens up an entirely new world of discussion for this tournament. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Season Finals Upper Bracket Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. Man, that is a mouthful to say. Up on the screen, you can see the updated bracket after Round Number 1. Certainly not the bracket I think all of us were anticipating. We see Mad Lions and Fnatic moving on to Winners Finals here, and G2 and BDS moving down to the lower parts of the bracket. They've been slotted in against these opponents because of seeding. GX is always going to face the higher seed. SK was always going to face the lower seed, which means that we get a couple of matchups that I'm excited to preview. We will not be previewing Mad versus Fnatic here because that's not happening next weekend. We will cover that at the end of the next video that we do, but for now it's time to preview our lower bracket round number 1 matchup, starting of course with G2 taking on Giant X. This feels like it should be very obvious on paper. G2 probably shouldn't be in the lower bracket to begin with, and even though Giant X have been major overperformers for basically all of the summer split, I just don't really see a world in which they can match up against G2 unless something goes horribly wrong. Now, if Craps shows up some way, somehow, for a consistent period of time, you know, GX is really only winning off of the back of Jackies, and so there is generally a world in which I could imagine a win or two, but to get 3 of those, I just would feel incredibly suspicious of that, even with G2 probably not taking this tournament all that seriously. So G2 should win this, and it shouldn't be particularly close. But the more interesting series, BDS taking on SK Gaming, this is massive. I think both of these teams are really interesting to look at in terms of on the Rift, on paper. Really, this is going to come down to who is better, Rahel or Ice. I really do believe it's going to be that simple. If Ice and Labrov can win the bot lane 2v2, then I think BDS wins. Or if they can especially take over in late game teamfights. If Rahel and Luan can be the better bot lane and win more, at least early on in these games especially, then I think SK will probably win this series. It's really going to come down to which one of those bot lanes you trust more, because I think everything else across the map is relatively even. Adam versus Irrelevant, I think that's relatively even. They're both pretty similar players. I think when you look at the jungle matchup, Sheo versus Isma, I actually think they're basically identical in terms of playstyle. Sheo's just a little bit better at executing it, or at least a little bit more proven. And then you've got Nuke taking on a Niski, and I think that they kind of fill similar roles of being players that kind of want to help their team out, although Nuke is a little bit more of a carry. Overall, I think all of that is relatively equal, so I'm looking at the bot lane here. Whichever bot lane you think is better is going to move on for me. At least right now, I'm slightly leaning in favor of BDS, but man, I don't feel confident. Honestly, I would really not be shocked if Rahel and Luan really just were the best bot lane in the LEC, but this is their chance to prove it and to break the SK curse. A big matchup for them here, so we'll see how that ends up going down, but let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments section below. Who do you think's moving on in the lower bracket round number 1? G2, GX, BDS, and SK. Which 2 teams are coming out of those 2 series? If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we cover everything in the LEC on this channel, but we cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel. That's the LCS, LCK, and LPL as well, including, of course, the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially with playoffs and Worlds all coming up, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.